Yeah, welcome to another Mobycon Academy session. We're here today with Brett Petzer and myself, Ryan Jacobson. Brett and I work in our international team, and we're both based in our Delft office here, where we're in the studio today. Since Brett and I are somewhat new to the Mobycon team, and this is our first Mobycon Academy session, we thought we would begin by introducing ourselves. So I'll start with myself. I come from the field of urban design, planning, and landscape architecture. Prior to joining the Mobycon team, I was at the Department of City Planning in New York, working as an urban designer. My focus at Mobycon is really to bring visualization and design skills in our work in the design of public spaces. And you, Brett?
Yeah, well, it's quite tough to go right after you, Ryan. I have not worked at the planning department of the greatest city in the world, but I guess I would think of Amsterdam as the greatest city in the world, in the bike world. So I trained a little bit as an architect and then mainly as an urban planner in Cape Town in South Africa. I came to the Netherlands about 5 years ago to do a PhD at the Technical University of Eindhoven on really the possibilities for bike share in the country. And then, as you'll hear today, it turned into a whole other thing, but something that maybe is useful. And I think we'll get into it, but right now I'm working at Mobycon, also on French projects, trying to increase our presence in France and engage more with everything that's happening there in reallocating street space, and I also lecture at University of Utrecht.
Yeah, so in today's session, we're going to focus on one of many elements of Brett's PhD thesis, titled The Legal Street, Systematic Thinking About Claims on Public Space. Yeah, we do have a copy here.
It's available now in no bookstores. You have to come to my house.
So the format for today's session is going to consist of Brett doing a short presentation for you all, followed by a series of questions from myself. Please feel free to write any questions in the chat. We'll do our best throughout the presentation, really at the end of the presentation, to address some of those questions. And what I would ask Brett as he gets started here is to really sum up, give the audience a bit of a teaser about what they're going to learn in this this presentation.
It's very important to promise the bots something for their time, and our very valued viewers now and in the future. Really, Ryan, I'm going to be taking us all through my research as a whole, trying to show how this idea of the legal street emerged from problems that I was grappling with. It absolutely was not in my mind when I started. It's what came out at the end. Luckily, no one was too cross that it was miles away from what I was told to research. And I think in our discussion, I hope that we can talk about how to take this idea forward, how we can keep enriching it in our work at Mobycon, keep learning and maybe challenging it a little bit, and also what use it might have for people watching at home who want to remake their own streets or who are frustrated by the slow pace of change. So that's my ambition today. I hope we get there.
All right, great. Thanks for that little teaser, Brett. You're welcome to get started.
Yes, outstanding. All right, so let's get into it. I'm hoping I can do this in the time we have. So the legal street, that's the title, and in very shortly, what the legal street is it's a way of trying to put all of the little mechanisms, the mechanisms often quite hidden, that shape space in the street, that decide what goes in the street, what can be there, what can't be there, what has to fight to be there, and try to map it systematically as a diagram, but also in text, digging through different layers of regulation to find out who is deciding what goes in the street, and can we not so much change individual streets, but change the recipe for a street in our community, and maybe change things on a systematic level, hopefully. So that's kind of it. That's all it is. And how I got there is a little bit involved. So I'll take you through that. This is going to require some stamina, so bear with me. Basically, the problem I set out to solve was, how do we get from the picture on the left to the picture on the right? And why did most streets in most of the developed world stop at the middle picture? In this, what Haarlemmerdijk in Amsterdam looked like in 1971. This describes so much of the developed world, and also just many, many streets in my own upper middle income home country of South Africa. So not just the developed world by any means. How did some societies go further and become the picture on the right? And why, when so many cities have declared climate emergencies and have promised quick changes, are the changes slow and difficult and 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? Well, I came to the Netherlands to study transitions, and I came across this theory called really Socio-Technical Transitions. The idea that you can look at society and you can tell a story about how one technology takes over from another, but to explain why it was one technology and not others, why we've ended up in the world we have, you really have to look very carefully at all of the social aspects that go with the technical, so socio-technical. And I promise this is the hardest the theory is going to get. But this is a simple diagram, even though it looks complex, that explains how these people, these transitions theorists, see the world. What I noticed was that although many people had looked at mobility and many people had looked at cities, no one had really taken a proper look at just a street and what happens in it as a place where transitions happen or don't happen, you know. Why, again, some cities make it all the way to the last picture that we had before, and why other cities get stuck in the middle. This is how transitions happen according to the theorist Geels en Schot. It's quite a Dutch speciality, transitions, although by now it's spreading widely. Transition says that change happens like this. You've got the regime in the middle, the red bit. And the regime is really just how things are done now, the normal way of doing things, the straightforward way, the people who are currently powerful, the regulations that are the default, the way it works. Underneath, you have a niche level where there are many innovations that could one day make it through to the regime, but at the moment are still quite weak. They're not ready, perhaps, to compete in the marketplace. They're often just a small group of people who believe passionately in the idea. They're willing to back it with resources. But most of them, of course, never make it to the regime level. They never change the regime. The regime is often something that only changes incrementally in a way that the currently powerful people can manage well. And most niche innovations fail, right? And finally, at the top, you have this blue layer, which is the landscape. That's just the world beyond, where things happen that sometimes put pressure on this world of the regime and the niche. So in mobility, of course, it can be climate change. It can be shortages of certain commodities in the world that force the regime to think rapidly and carefully about how to sustain itself. And when you think of streets this way, you notice that you've got your niche cities like Amsterdam and Copenhagen, where cycling is a serious form of transport that is planned for, that is formal and stable. And then you've got, but there's only a few of them. And then you've got the automobility regime, which in the rest of the world is really dominant and may remain dominant, even though we should be moving away from it. It has many ways of reinventing itself, sustaining itself, making itself seem cleaner or greener, while still maybe having this disproportionate claim on space. So that's transitions, and it's a way to try to describe across energy, water, mobility, many fields, what is needed for a transition to finally get going, and why, especially, why good ideas fail, and fail at the expense of much less promising ideas where maybe the politics is better or the money is better. So applying transitions to a street led me to all of these wonderful historians. We've got Henk-Jan Dekker here. He worked with me at Eindhoven. He's just published this wonderful study of how the Dutch bike lane came to be as a formal, regulated, legal thing.
What's the name of that?
This is called
resource?
literally Cycling Pathways by Henk-Jan Dekker, and he's a young academic with me at Eindhoven. And we've also got, of course, wonderful histories of streets, how the modern street came to be. I mean, Peter Norton is probably the big name in that field. He wrote this wonderful study of how the American street went from this, and how streets in really much of the world went from this very vibrant mixed space, a big, obviously public space, as we can see in any photo of an American or European city before the 1950s. You know, everything is happening in the street, and it's happening everywhere. There are trams, there are cars, but there's kids playing, there's lots of commerce, there's demonstrations, there's a lot going on. And then really very quickly we get to this modern street where what was this public space, what was this quite sort of mixed, more like a forest, has become something a little bit more like a farm. In the middle you have car space, and especially in the States, as you know, car space is really well protected legally. If you walk in it, you're jaywalking, and that crime, the invention of the idea that you legally can't walk in a city except where it's allowed, that's the kind of thing that Peter Norton tells a very good story about in his book. So simply, at some point there's this transition. We get from this rich space in cities to this very regulated space. We have car space, it has a kind of a legal status, and very soon it also gets engineering that goes along with it, that marks the space for cars in the city. And over time, across much of the world, every other thing except car space has to fit into this residual category that's left over. Pedestrian space, but it's also the space for bins and signs and chairs and tables, as we know. So that's it. This is a very simple story, I think, that we're all aware of in history. And what's important to note is that there are these legal categories of space in the street now, but some of them are really well protected by regulation, and some of them are not. And I think we're definitely going to get into it in our questions, but of course we know car space has all these mathematical and geometric dimensions. You can't make it smaller beyond a certain standard. It's legally fixed. Whereas pedestrian space and cycling space are really at the mercy of whoever's making decisions locally. I think we've seen everywhere signs for a bike lane. I know of often in the UK and the US where the bike lane is too narrow even for the size of the icon of the bicycle, you know. And that's an example of car space is quite standard across the whole planet, and that's maintained in various ways. And then bike space is just a local idea that changes everywhere you go. So that's this idea of compressibility, that some kinds of space and some kinds of space uses in the city can be endlessly compressed and made to overlap, whereas others sort of mainly are by themselves. Car space just is there, and the other kinds of space you have to fit them in around it. Simple. Again, if you've ever been in a city, this is what it looks like. Basically, with few only a few exemptions in the world. So one of the last ideas that I just want to kind of lay out is a space claim. And that was when I went and started to look at how cities are allocating their space. I tried to create this concept of a space claim, which is just assume that this public space in a city is empty, it's unallocated, it's like that's streets from before the 1940s. There's everything to play for. And how does it get allocated? How do we end up with parking spaces painted, perhaps a bike lane, the road for cars, the rest for pedestrians? Well, people make space claims. They claim the space, and some of the space claims are approved and some are not, you know? And some of the space claims are really easy and some are really hard to make. And sometimes before you want to make a space claim, as it might be for bike space in your community, you have to, for yourself, invent really the kind of form that you want, the bike lane. You have to, it's not an obvious agreed concept in so many places because it changes all the time. So it's hard to get a whole group of people to organize around it. And it's just not that way for car space. It's usually already there. If you do want to change stuff in your community for car space, usually at most you just have to fight to keep some parking, so that's really the street. And there's this last concept of a lock-in, which is, if I can go back there to the, this last concept of a lock-in is, in transitions, something becomes locked in once the alternatives are just no longer viable, like VHS or DVDs or now streaming a little bit. You're kind of, the world is locked into streaming. It's very hard to compete with an alternative. So lock-in is when the space is so dominated by cars that what's left is a very small prize, and it's highly contested by pedestrian advocates and disability advocates and cycling advocates and the people who want more on-street dining. And they have to fight so hard for so little that it makes their fights, more difficult, really. Difficult to get people organized. And that's a bit lock-in, where car space has a lock-in. So that's really it. I think I want to here show red and green, using the colors to show that red is maybe belonging to the car regime, dominant mobility regime, and cycling space and pedestrian space here are green to show that they really belong to niches, even if there's always been walking and cycling is at least as old as the car. I think, yeah, technically older. Some kinds of space are really obvious, they're uncontested, and the other kinds, the niche spaces, it's a hell of a fight. It's never over, and good things get overturned all the time. So that's it. There are these allocation mechanisms, which is all of the ways that the space gets allocated, that the space claims can actually be advanced. And then there are appropriation practices, which is how you can disobey, perhaps, the law and claim space for yourself, like people protesting and shutting down streets, or painting guerrilla bike lanes, or as well car drivers who just appropriate space by parking on the sidewalk, whether it's legal or illegal, but then other people have to pick their way past, and maybe they can't get past at all, you know. So that's it, that's the legal street. And if I can go back to our slides, in the rest of my time, I just want to quickly show you how did I get there. Well, I came here and I realized that bike share had a brief boom in the Netherlands in 2017, and everybody was cross. And that makes a little, at the beginning that was really confusing, because this is a cycling country. Why is it so controversial to have this other kind of bicycle? And I realized that, well, this bicycle isn't owned by a person, so it doesn't have all these amazing rights that cyclists have. It's owned by a company, and it makes it illegitimate in the Dutch public realm. Or at least it did then. There was quite the backlash. And then I went and mapped all of these schemes to see how are they trying to legitimate their presence in the street? How are they trying to make a space claim? And I looked at their business models, and I found that what really mattered was how closely they resemble the existing strategy by which just everyday cyclists in the Netherlands have claimed space for themselves. And as you know, cycle parking in the Netherlands is just it's just wherever, you know. It's everywhere, and even where it may not be, it is there, but this is respected, tolerated, and I think people take pride in it. And that's kind of an example of how a norm can build up here that's so different from other places, but it has cultural, technical, social components. So it's just a little bit of an illustration of how I found my way to this concept of the legal street. A second thing that led me to it was looking at, well, what works for people when they're trying to make a space claim for a good thing, a socially good thing, and they're arguing that it's ethical, it's just, and that led me to this wonderful framework, Mobility Justice by Mimi Scheller, which is kind of also a really big name. Mimi Scheller says there's a lot of mobility justice in the world, there's a lot of mobility injustice, and what especially her work helped me to see is to look at immobility as well. How much people who want to be mobile in certain ways, like cycling, can't be. The street disallows it. It's like an infrastructural ban in so much of the world outside the Netherlands, which I think, again, you like me have received lots of visitors here, and people are stunned by how it is. But it's very hard sometimes for Dutch people to ask themselves, but why is it only us? As much as people who come visit here are amazed and sometimes think, well, why can't we have this at home? What's actually stopping us? You know? So really that's it. When I went, I looked at a lot of arguments that people made online, trying to put together storylines about why their space claim should be granted, why they should have what they want. And especially people that resisted those claims. So some people argued for bike share, only scale will tell. These bikes have no owner, so they have no caretaker, so they shouldn't be in public space. Others said with time they'll be legitimated. Others said, well, they're being abused, so that shows you that the public is rejecting them. And especially a lot of people argue these just don't fit in a Dutch street. This doesn't fit in our country. This is not how we deal with space. So these studies, they're looking at the arguments that people make and the ethics that they use, and then also looking at business models that can legitimate or delegitimate something, finally just led me to understand, well, it's complex. There needs to be this container that we can use to put all of these mechanisms, these conditions of what gets allowed in the street into a single framework. And then the promise, and now we're finished with this presentation, is to hopefully that when we do that and we put everything in one framework, we'll see how the space claims, the allocation mechanisms for cars, even in the Netherlands, are still really strong. And how maybe if we start to change these mechanisms very systematically, we can get further faster than by fighting one street at a time. But these are big claims, and I know we're gonna work through it. So that's that's the whole deal, basically.
Well, Brett, I wanted to thank you for the I would call it a teaser. I'm sure. I'm sure that it is insanely hard to summarize a multi-year research project in 20 minutes.
Fly me over to wherever the clients are, and you'll see. Right? I'll do my best.
So thank you for doing that in a succinct manner. I did want to see if we have any questions from the audience. I'm getting a head shaking no.
We will be making them up to suit ourselves. And those people hustle.
So maybe just to get started out, I'm wondering if there's a single factor that you can attribute to this slow transition in the context of street space.
Well, I'm totally surprised by your question, Ryan, but it's an excellent one. Ryan, it's down to regulations being strong or weak, and that, to me, in the context of the legal street, means that on quite a deep level, is there a consensus about what car space is, what a parking space is? or is there not? Yes, there is. We know what a car parking space is. It's got all these definitions. You can't change it to suit yourself as a country or a city. There's all these international treaties and national treaties, and you have little power as a community to change it. It's just a given. And it's also enmeshed in lots of other systems in often quite a hidden way. Whereas the regulation around car space and pedestrian space is really weak. It exists, but it's not easy to defend. People can decide for themselves that a bike space needs to be only 50 centimeters wide if that solves somebody's local problem of, well, otherwise we have to take away some car parking, so fine. It's a bike lane. You know. And so really it's that. It links back a lot to the regime and the niche. A regime is really something that's unquestioned. You know, it's just how things are done. It's the grown-up way of doing things, like providing mobility for people. Whereas niche ideas, niche innovations, they have to keep making their case over and over again, and they're really vulnerable to challenge. Which is, I think, true of bike space especially, but also of pedestrian space. You have to keep fighting these battles. And to go a bit further from your question, one aspect of that that's really important is it uses up a lot of time, hundreds of hours of public time and volunteer time to fight for a small amount of bike lane. Probably, you know, tens of or hundreds of hours per square meter that you get in the end. And even then it can be overturned, as we've seen, I think, in London with some of these pandemic bike lanes or low traffic neighborhoods that have been overturned really easily. So that's the difference. Are the regulations strong or weak? And with that, the one thing about the strong regulations is they're mostly often invisible. They don't they're hard to find, but they operate really successfully. Mm-hmm. Whereas the weak ones have to be so visible. There has to be a petition, there has to be 10 community meetings, you know, so that's it. For bike space to happen, anybody, the whole community has to agree, and if anybody objects, then that's a huge problem. Whereas we don't hold fundraisers for local highways for cars. They just are built. Anyway, that's a very long answer.
Yeah, well, that's okay. I'm wondering if we could actually go back to one of the slides.
Sure,
there's the slide with the red and the green stripes.
Oh, wonderful, yes.
Yeah.
I'll go right back. Red and green stripes. You're telling me about this one?
Yeah,
yes.
This slide right
sure.
here. Yeah.
There we go. Wonderful, thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's my computer on in its evening setting.
It's okay.
Getting me ready for bed.
It's okay. We just need this slide as a reference. So,
sure.
It's interesting to point out in this slide these modally defined spaces, and you talked a lot about mass motorization in your presentation. What that has undoubtedly led to for mobility planners is really thinking about flow. Right. And so in each of these modally defined places, flow becomes highly, highly valued.
Right.
And
yes.
I'm wondering how the legal street emphasizes either this kind of methodology or thinking about the street in a more dynamic way as a shared space.
I'm very happy to answer that because, but I do not have, I have this kind of an answer. The legal street is certainly, I think, focused on these modally specific spaces. But it can either be a way of remaking the street, and it's remaking these modally specific spaces, or unmaking them. Both are possible, and I think it's really an open question in our city planning of which one is better. So when I say unmaking these modally specific spaces, I guess that leaves us with a big shared space where we might try to define the street in a different way, like saying, well, all modes, all vehicles of any kind are welcome, but nothing must go faster than 30 kilometers an hour, and nothing may emit poisonous smoke that kills people. Let's have that as a groundbreaking decision. And in that, I really follow from my colleague Sam Nello-Deacon, who wrote, "What is a fair allocation of street space, of road space?" And he made this point as well, that if we stay in this paradigm of absolutely deciding that some modes will have an exclusive claim to this parcel of space and we paint around it so everybody knows, then maybe we're, as you say, we're just reproducing the car paradigm of excluding everything else, having only this mode and making it flow. But I also think that we might not yet be at a point where we know for sure that bike space, especially when we're trying to create a cycling culture globally or give people alternatives to cars, it might be that initially we do need protected bike space to tempt that first generation of cyclists and normalize cycling. So to me, that's a totally open question, but I think you make a very good point, and I hope that the legal street can serve to remake or unmake modally specific space.
Mm-hmm. I had another question that's in relation to really at what scale of thinking is the legal street? You put up some really these sectional diagrams really describe what the obvious issue is.
Yes, absolutely.
You talk a little bit about the applicability. In my mind as an urban designer, I want to dig into this context right here.
Sure.
But I'm wondering, at what scale is the legal street concept most successfully operating?
Oh, absolutely. I'd say it probably is most successful at the really the broadest possible spatial scale, and maybe is less and less, is more and more time consuming, maybe less rewarding as you go down to the level of actually a specific street. But with that, I think there's a lot of power in making people think of streets in the aggregate, as the average street. Because when we do fight for, say, a better street, maybe space for more than just cars in a street, we do fight on a street-by-street basis, individually. But when the car system creates car parking, uses parking minimums, then these are applied really in a blanket way across whole countries, whole provinces, whole states, whole cities. So they're applied in a blanket way en masse. The fight for parking, say in the States, was not a street-by-street fight. It was one at the highest levels, and it kind of trickled down as new cities were made. They were organized around this. So basically, I think the useful way to think about the legal street is that if you were to go to a given place and try to understand what is its recipe for making streets, what usually gets done, what just gets done by default, whether anybody asks for them or not. That's a good way to apply the legal street and show, here's the recipe for a local connector street or a typical neighborhood street in our country or province or state. This is how the engineers and the urban planners keep making new streets, and this is what happens by default. It operates mostly out of sight. And I always come back to, obviously, the example of a parking minimum as one example of a way that to go and to find the legal street, you have to go and look in a lot of places to see what is the recipe for a street. You have to look at, obviously, engineering guidelines, and even in this country, we have the CROV, the CROW guidelines, which are not really legal, but cities just tend to follow them quite successfully, I think, for bikes. But in many other countries, it's an engineering book that says cars are definite, everything else is a bit optional. And these things, they just tick on. So the legal street is maybe about uncovering all of this information and putting it in one place and making it visible. The way that a parking minimum is a sort of, it converts what's happening in the private space, residential uses, into a space claim that's automatic. If this is happening in the private space, somebody's living there, then in the public space, there must be 2 parking spaces. You know, it makes the space claim, but it's a mechanism that operates automatically. And that's the kind of detail that I think the legal street brings out well. So that if we can keep fighting and thinking on this level, we might be more successful on the street-by-street fights, I think. Hope that...
Yeah. I think that answers the question, and I'm also wondering if the legal street can be applied to any context. If there are different types of government structures or regulatory jurisdictions that, or political jurisdictions that challenge the legal street.
Oh, that's a good point. I think when I looked at it and when I developed it, to be honest, I really did look at the Netherlands and neighboring countries. And I looked at them, you know, partly because these are the high emitting countries of the world. Their consumption is the thing that most needs to change. Whereas the vast, all of the incredible urban complexity of the developing world or the global south, I think would be a lot harder to capture in this kind of diagram. Yep. They're perhaps more complex, and there's perhaps the street categories are much more porous, and it's possibly just not useful to think in this way. So I think it has a lot of limitations, but maybe to the extent that it captures a kind of street that is well defined legally, and where those regulations do quite closely resemble what's actually happening in life, then I think it's useful. It's going to be useful there. And those are, you know, high emitting countries, and they have a lot of the cars. So I hope it's useful in that way.
Yeah, and if I'm an audience member and I want to go about creating a legal street, how do I get there? Who am I?
Oh, yes. Oh, well, we'll email you a kit.
Yeah, who is this most applicable to?
You cut it out at home. It's easy to assemble, just a bit of glue. If you want to make a legal street, you hire me, or you simply go digging around your neighborhood, your community, and you start at the local level and you work up, and you find engineering guidelines and plans for streets, and you find parking minimums, and you basically go hunting, and you will probably have to work quite hard. It's mostly the case that to really understand the mobility policy of where you live, it's very seldom a PDF. That's whatever PDF you can download that's called that is usually just a part of it, because I think for so much of the mass motorized world, the mobility policy is really in the building regulations, because it's actually the parking policy. That until you change that, there's not much to fight for in changing the mobility policy, you know, or the plan, or the 5-year plan, or the vision. So I think that's it, is if you want to make a legal street, you go digging, and hopefully by thinking systematically, all that time that you invest in finding out what's what locally can be saved for somebody else who's in a similar context, that you can instead put your time towards making the mechanisms that keep doing the things different. And I think that's the hope, or at least visible. And I think especially for us as Mobycon, as consultants who largely, where we're called in, the clients we talk to, they want to see the change, but there are many mechanisms that constrain their ability to do differently. There's this kind of dead mobility policy that's hidden away, tucked into other things. And so really the mobility street is just about collecting that in one place and making it comparable. and showing that, if I can extend a little bit, to say, if it takes so many 100 hours to fight for one bike lane in our city, and we know historically, look at the last 10 years, that has been true. We can sort of say there was this much bike lane made, and it took so many community meetings and so on. It took the hours and the time of everybody who attended. There's a quantity of time and effort per meter of bike lane. And maybe we can get to a point where elected representatives can say, if that is the cost of a space claim in our community, and we want the space claims to succeed, and somehow we lack the power to change it ourselves, then let us fund these activists, or let us reimburse them for their time. Or if we promise that there will be X kilometers of bike lanes, then let it be known that we actually need to enable so many 100 hours of activism to happen, if that's how our system works.
Yep.
And I guess also just to say, to make the car system visible, and to say it takes no amount of time or very little to keep car infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the mechanisms are so much in favor of it. It's really hard to fight against it, but maybe now we can put numbers to it, basically.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. I'm wondering, as part of your research, if you came across any cities that were cutting edge in terms of this transition in street space.
Oh, absolutely.
Any good examples where this kind of concept is already being applied?
Well, I mean, of course, these people all have been working from my playbook. Berlin, you know. Nobody at all has ever heard of my research, but they are doing the things that I am asking for, and they're doing it because millions of people have been asking for it for a long time. I did hope that in 2021 we'd be further along. But I mean, some wonderful local examples, I think, are Berlin, for example, which defined in a referendum, which I think was just an advisory referendum, defined a large part of the city and dared to put the question in a blanket sense: what if we invalidated all the on-street space, the on-street claims for car space, the claims for on-street car space? What if we just invalidated them? What if we started with that? All of them gone, and you can fight for them back on a case-by-case basis. I'm definitely oversimplifying the recent referendum in Berlin, but I think that's the kind of thinking that pushes back against the idea that we make car space on a huge scale, but we can only unmake it on a tiny particular scale in which every single person involved must have a say. I mean, this public participation is good, but it is too slow. It is not realistic given the rate of change that these cities really must achieve to keep their people safe in a stable climate. So Berlin, lots of other examples. We can always, I suppose, begin with Curitiba and Bogota and Medellin, these great global south cities that also moved decisively, quickly, and made, I think in the case of Medellin, a claim that said 1 day a week, we make a space claim of all public space on main streets in the city for everything but cars, you know. And they just made the claim, and it was done, it was executed, and it produces, I think it has a lot of political effects. It's a great inspiration. So yeah, systematic thinking, I think, on a bold scale.
Yeah, I also wanted to add that I was in New York during the pandemic, and of course New York changed its streets dramatically over the course of about a year through the open restaurants and the open storefronts program.
Yes.
So you saw a lot of these ground floor tenants of buildings that were making a claim on that sidewalk or street or parking lane space. And so I'm wondering what the role of these ground floor tenants should be in the
Good point. I think New York's a great example. The pandemic was such a moment across the world when there was this, what I once in one of my caffeinated Twitter rants called the Great Reclamation, the Great Reallocation, perhaps. New York was an example of the margins of the street being reallocated, and it took a global pandemic for that to happen. In the city where Jane Jacobs has written so much of her work, and where today you can park your private property, your car, only if it is a car, can you take up, you have an entitlement to your choice of on-street space in New York for very, very cheap. And anybody can drive a massive car right into Manhattan and just claim the space. I think that's a good example because space claims were made for for the ability to dine in a sort of semi-indoor, outdoor way. Great. And those were successful. But that left, in many cases, very little space for people to walk. And I think, I saw online a lot of videos of wheelchair users who are just trying to do their lives, not leisure activity, trying to go where they need to go, and working their way through what is now the inside of a restaurant on the sidewalk. And while all of this was happening, the car streets didn't get any narrower. Mostly car parking still exists in one of the densest places in the world, this iconic city. And I think it's a great example of fighting at the margins for scraps, while the city, in most cases, was not very bold in unmaking the space claims of cars. They were largely left intact in New York. So I think that's a great example of the pedestrian space just being infinitely compressible. Just keep adding and adding and adding uses to it, all of which deserve to be in the city, but do not deserve to jostle with each other so much. And then leaving intact this powerful regulatory protection on car space. I think that's an example of, if we could apply the legal street to that, maybe the answer would have been just remove the cars and let the people work it out. Mm-hmm. Let there be wheelchair and bike space right down the center of this broad street. 15 subway lines are converging. Maybe you don't need to park your own SUV from the suburbs there. Yeah. I think, again, none of this is new to anybody who's doing these fights. My only contribution, I hope, was to try to connect it to this older theory of how transitions succeed and why good ideas really fail. Mm-hmm. For why good technologies fail for reasons that are not technological.
Yeah. And similar to what we've seen during the pandemic for years, I would say at least the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen a plethora of these tactical urbanism projects and temporary pilot projects. I'm wondering, what is the role of this kind of incrementalism in transitions theory?
And that's fascinating because incrementalism is something that in this little theory that I've really oversimplified is really associated with helping the regime to survive. Keeping things fundamentally the way they are, but allowing the regime to absorb challenges and shocks and roll with them a little, but ultimately right itself and go on. I think a really great example of that is the move from petrol cars and internal combustion engines to electric cars, which still have the same space requirements, even though now they do not directly emit things that kill people from their exhaust pipe. So that's already great, but they are still cars, and they are still a private room of your house that you take with you into the public space of the city. So when it comes to tactical urbanism, it's such a wonderful thing. It's got great shock value, and it's got great value in making people rethink, and it moves fast. And all of these things are essential. We need this. But it's probably not a substitute for the systematic change. We make car streets and we make car parking at so many hundreds of times the scale at which we are making new bike streets and bike parking. You know, we are subdividing in the global north. We are producing, selling cars in the millions, and each car that goes out into the world brings with it a highly incentivized person who's going to fight for parking entitlements and space claims wherever that car goes. There must be parking space at the beginning and end of each car journey. So tactical urbanism is so important, but I think if we stop there, the seas will boil. It's got to be the beginning, but I find maybe with New York, maybe you can speak to New York, where New York led in a tactical way, had the world's attention for a good moment.
Yeah.
And so many radical changes happened that people had advocated for so long. And then there's been perhaps a bit of a lull since then, where that pace...
Honestly, the pandemic was the boost
to
get over the...
Yes, can you imagine?
Actually, there were programs such as the Open Streets restaurant program, which converted entire streets to dining streets.
Yes.
So a massive amount of space radically changed. And I think that there are some advocacy organizations in New York that are really pushing the city further to really kind of make this serious transition.
Yes.
So we will see what happens over the next 5 to 10 years there. Yeah.
I mean, it is so powerful that suddenly, very much, I think Paris is an example of this, that Paris really made everybody, I think Paris is embarrassing the large cities of the world with a pace of change that wasn't supposed to be possible. For them, I think it's so far beyond tactical. They're just making and approving and then executing the space claims, and they're just doing that in days and weekends and weeks, not decades. So maybe it's a little example of that we have thought for a long time that incremental was as good as it gets and tactical was as good as it gets. But I think some cities have shown that that truly can be just the first round.
Yeah.
And then you remake at dizzying speed.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing so much pressure from climate change that it's helping some politicians be extremely bold.
Oh my goodness.
I love the Paris example.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going there this weekend to film things happening, to film all the bike space that I can, and all the new infrastructure, and also I think to maybe perhaps push that argument further that the social change and the behavior change is so quick. Actually, people have argued that some people argue that Americans love their cars and that they have this love for cars, and that always the design of urban space should genuflect to this love, because this love is unchanging. Peter Norton is really great at going back and showing how long American cities fought against the idea that the car would be the only serious mode of urban transport, and how long it took for them to be completely defeated, and how odd the story really is. I mean, I think we have 6 minutes left, so depending on your questions, I always like to get to that story of how petrol cars really broke through. It's so different from, maybe you have another question that it takes precedent on anecdotes.
Yeah. Well, we have some other organizational concepts that we've been working on at Mobycon, such as the mobility donut. So I'm wondering how this fits in to our plethora of organizational concepts.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
How you envision this being utilized?
Well, great. This is, I think that's going to be a lot of hard work, but I think it's going to be the work I probably enjoy the most in the next few months, is Mobycon's been doing this for a long time. It's people have a huge amount of tacit and some explicit knowledge about what works, what breaks through, how to make proposals that are going to survive the political process in a community, and as much as we can guess how that process works, or listen to the client and learn. So with that, all that embedded tacit knowledge, which I think can only enrich something like the legal streets, because everything in here is obvious to people really engaged in street fights. But I think that when it comes to the mobility donut, that's the example of a concept that we've really pulled down from big global theory from Kate Raworth, the economist, and tried to frame in mobility terms, and then put our knowledge and our way of seeing the world and our experiences into it, and ended up with the mobility donut.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that because the mobility donut rests on an ethical argument,
Mm-hmm.
that there can be too much and too little mobility, and you need the Goldilocks mobility right in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Mobility that doesn't immobilize others because it requires such a disproportionate share of public resources, but also helping people who have too little mobility to fully thrive to have more. I think that's closely related to the legal street.
Yeah.
And maybe I think the mobility donut is looking down at society in a sort of a plan view,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe the legal street is a section view of what happens when you multiply a regime by power, or perhaps put differently, a mobility mode by the power of a regime. You get the result, which is this much space,
Mm-hmm.
and everything else getting condensed or pushed back or just disappearing.
Yeah.
So I do think there are two ways of looking at the same problem, and I'm really excited in the future. I think we've had some meetings already to sort of create a theory of change for Mobycon that works on, maybe takes a few samples out of this vast lake of experience of people who've been doing this for long and been winning these fights with clients.
Mm-hmm.
Civilized
arguments.
Right? Yes. And bring it together into a theory of change that maybe can be a little bit of a calling card for us. And
So we just have a couple minutes left. I just want to ask for our listeners on the call, if they found this interesting, how can they get information on this topic? Will there be a future blog post coming?
Yes, there will certainly be a blog post coming now that I have to rapidly put my...
Good luck summarizing.
Yes,
even
exactly,
further.
exactly. Just work out how to do footnotes online, and we're set. I think that people can get hold of us. I hope that they do. And I hope that using the mobility donut and perhaps the legal street as well, but also a whole raft of other concepts that we have, that we can really get better at fighting the fights about values and norms, that really fights about social, deep cultural transitions, which are going to get sharp really quickly as the scale at which we need to start changing our streets accelerates. As there is not much time for us to make a huge amount of change. And so I do believe that in the future that's something where we might be very useful to be sharp and specific and strategic about helping people to see all the immobility that they currently are saddled with, as well as the mobility that they can see, the car system, and helping make that visible, I think.
Yeah. All right. So I want to thank Brett for
Thank you, Ron.
this vast amount of knowledge that he has imparted on myself and the audience here.
Yeah, you're real captive audience.
I also want to thank everyone who joined the session today and who listens to the session in the future. If you enjoyed this talk about the legal street, please like and subscribe. and also visit our website at academy.mobycon.com. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much.